so glad you're joining us and appreciate your area of expertise and look forward to working with you. I'm Karen Tronsgard-Scott, and I use she/they pronouns, and I work at the Vermont Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, and my role there is as its executive director.
Mike from the road.
Hi, Tiffany. I'm Mike O'Neill. I'm the executive director of the Troopers Association. I'm a retired state trooper. I retired as a sergeant and been retired about 6 years now.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Tucker, you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, Tiffany. My name's Tucker Jones, and I'm an attorney at the Department of Public Safety. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
And Jen, I don't know if you're able to introduce yourself.
Why not? Jen Frank, I'm the chief of police over in Windsor and for the town of West Windsor. I serve on the Act 56 committee, but I also serve on the Internal Affairs Regional Investigative Team for the state of Vermont. And really excited to meet you and look forward to working with you.
Thank you.
Before that, I just want to mention, so we don't have Chris Loris on the committee, and we no longer have Aaron Jacobson, but we now have Tiffany. And we reached out to Dominica to see if she could take Aaron's place to represent the AG's office, and she's unfortunately just stretched pretty thin right now with committee work and trial work, so she's not able to be with us. And on our original committee, both Chris and I were counted as committee members. And for a variety of reasons, some of them being to make quorum, I was talking to Chris about it being smart for me not to be an official committee member. Like, we don't need 2 votes, right, from the council, staff council perspective. So I'm here as support staff, happy to take minutes, but I'm not going to be an actual committee member. So that'll have us be a committee of 9, and quorum being 5 for this committee. So that's just a few little logistical things for everyone. We do not have a committee chair with Chris Loris leaving. I believe Jen was our vice chair, and I didn't have time to double check my notes on that.
That's correct.
I don't know, is that right, Jen?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I didn't want to make that up and then push anything forward. So in any event, we do need a chair, and that's for you all to discuss how you'd like to do that.
And Kim, we will have Jim Whitcomb, but he just wasn't able to make it today. So Jim will be joining.
Exactly. Jim and Trevor are still on the committee and they're on vacation this week. And then Jim felt comfortable knowing Tucker was here. Check in with.
So can we nominate Trevor in his absence for chair?
Always a good idea.
That's how we did Chris Loris, right?
I think we did.
How about this? How about I will nominate Trevor, and I would like to, if folks would still keep me as vice chair, if Trevor refuses, I would be willing to do a swap with him. But I prefer he remain chair and I'd take vice chair. But if he says no, I'm willing to hold the spot.
I would support that.
As would I. Trevor may hate us for it afterwards, but I know he's up to the task. So
He won't be surprised.
it's true. He won't be.
My.
And he won't miss any future meetings. No one on the committee will. That's the start of it. Any other suggestions, or does someone want to? It sounds like Jen's making a motion.
Well, I'll
I'll
second
make it
it.
formal. I make a motion to place Trevor in the position of the chair for this committee, and for me to remain as in the vice chair position.
I'll second.
As Kim's taking this role, we'll let her go through and call the vote.
Go right ahead and vote. Anyone opposed, I'll say. All right, passes. Great. So Jen, as vice chair, but you're driving, do you want to kind of run the meeting, or would you like us to?
How about I'll assume my duties next meeting? I'm almost at a spot where I'll be stationary and I'll be able to actually zoom in, but if you guys wouldn't mind continuing to run it, and then I'm happy to assume duties moving forward
We don't
next meeting.
mind at all. So the next thing on the list is setting up standing meetings, and I know that's hard since we're missing Mark as well, Mark Anderson. So Trevor, Mark, and Jim are missing today, but and we can move the meeting issue to the end after we talk about the work that needs to be done, if that makes more sense to kind of know what we have before us. Up to you all.
I think that makes sense. Get
That
a
makes
sense
sense
of,
too.
yeah, just how much work and how much time we think that's going to take, and then set up the meetings pursuant to that time frame.
Okay, so we'll come back to that. All right. Chris, do you want to just officially, since I'm not a committee member, do you want to tee up the next item?
Sure. Yeah, so the next thing that we want to do is discuss the editing of the code of conduct that we promoted to the council in our final report. And how do we want to kind of proceed with that work, and what does that look like? I think and you may have discussed this, Kim, with Tiffany already, but there was a lot of work that we came up with in this code of conduct that we presented to the council, and there were a couple of areas that we did know would still need some finer, refinement to what that code of conduct actually looked like. But the framework is all there. So I think, does everybody have the copy of the code of conduct that was put out?
Yes.
Yes.
Seeing head shake. Okay. So with that in mind, then I think if we wanted to take a look at that and see if there are very specific areas that we felt needed more work. I know that we had some discussion we had a lot of discussion around the area of discrimination, but I think we covered it with the lengthy definition in there. But was there any one outlier of the 10 actual items that we found on there that anyone would like to start with first, or they feel needs more clarification? All right, I'm going back and forth between the document and that, so I'm not seeing if anybody has it, just speak up. It's easier for me to pay attention that way.
Just the way I remember leaving this off when we were last meeting about this was that, from my perspective and from sign-offs within the Department of Public Safety, we felt comfortable with all of the language that was in that draft that was included in the report to the legislature, as a sign off on all of that as it was. And, we were kind of prepared that that was going to be either codified in statute or codified as it was at that time in some form or another, as essentially a final version. So I don't know, I don't have any tweaks to it from DPS's perspective.
Okay. Well,
And I think we
no,
had
go
left
ahead.
it where it wasn't, I was just going to say, I thought we'd left the details where it wasn't going to be necessarily codified by statute, but that it would be relegated back to the council, so that if the council needed to make modifications, we weren't reliant on the legislature to move forward on that.
right. Mike, did you have something else that you were going to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to say the same. I think we were prepared for it to go back to the council, but from what I recall, from our perspective, I was comfortable with the language as final language if that's how it came out.
Okay, and I think all of us in that work group were fine with that language. Where we really wanted to discuss was what does that process then look like when, how do we meet the sanctions of what the rules committee is going to need so that we get what the content of the code of conduct is, how that's implemented, and then how we do any future modifications to it. So if everybody is okay with how we left off with that code of conduct. Sorry, I just got back to the screen. Kim got your hand up. Speak,
All right.
speak out.
Yeah, before Chris goes ahead, so my recollection was that, yes, we felt really good with what we had drafted. I think we still wanted some other eyes to look at it outside of us to see, did we capture everything we wanted to capture and that the wording, right, wasn't accidentally missing something. And so I wonder if part of reviewing this draft before it goes to the council is thinking through who else should we have look at this and give any feedback on it.
Yeah, and just as a follow-up to that, I know Kim and I have had a couple of conversations where I think it was potentially, was it the chiefs and sheriffs meeting, Kim, that you attended, where this was brought up and there appeared to be many faces that looked totally surprised by this and didn't know that this was coming, even though they had representation on this committee. And that's no reflection of Jen or Sheriff Anderson. I know that they pump out a lot of information and a lot of it just goes right by people because it comes fast and furious sometimes. And when somebody hears it, when you're talking to a captive audience, it might be a little bit different than something that was sent out to them in an email to keep everybody informed. So good point, Jen.
I can speak
I
to
don't
what
know.
that frustration. I can speak to what that
Yeah.
was. Their frustration. They knew about it and they were familiar with the code of conduct. They've all received emails and given an opportunity to respond. What their frustration was that the legislature had authorized something that hadn't been finalized, and that was just a point of frustration. So the legislature said, I'm going to be held to this code of conduct, but they haven't actually said what this code of conduct is yet. And so it was more of a process issue that was stressing people out. So I could be decertified for not following a code of conduct, but we don't know what the code of conduct is. That was the frustration that was happening at the chiefs meetings. I talked with several people after that. And that's, again, where I explained to them that we don't want the legislature dictating what the code of conduct is because that doesn't allow for any change, right? Like, 10 years ago, marijuana was, had a different penalty than it does today. We recognize things change, and we don't want to be, 3 years later stuck with a code of conduct that doesn't account for something new that we hadn't considered. So.
Good to know that you followed up with them, because I think that was a concern of Kim's, that maybe that information wasn't clear, but that makes total sense if they're assuming that the legislature already codified what was there without the process taking place. And the process piece is really where we were going next after the code of conduct, once we clarified that piece.
Right, and they felt like they were putting the apple before, the horse before the cart. And one of those things of, why wouldn't you come up with a code of conduct first and then put it before the legislature? And from a process standpoint, what they don't understand was that the legislation session was coming to a conclusion and we needed to move forward regardless.
That, plus I think the legislature also was trying to do the council a favor by knowing that this wasn't going to be a final piece and that we still had to come up with the process of how that code of conduct would be implemented. So I'm hopeful that, Jen, your message got across to those that had at least expressed concern during that meeting.
I'm happy to re-underscore that.
We might want to consider a communication to the profession writ large this summer to explain where things stand with the legislation, what we mean by this code of conduct, perhaps include the draft of it, the current draft of it that we have, and solicit feedback before it goes through the formal rules process. That because it sounds like people are wondering, yeah, if that's probably worth pushing out to the field in some capacity, in some way.
Well, and I think that helps in the general buy-in to it as well. Like, I think we, A,
Mhm.
would want genuine feedback, and then B, you were able to see it, we were able to explain the process, and then you see the end result of it without it just going right to end result for the profession.
Yeah, and also making sure that we reach out to those smaller entities that are encapsulated by this code of conduct that might not pay attention to chiefs or sheriffs or be on their list. Any other law enforcement that work for DMV or the AG's office, or they're still held by this, will be held by the same code of conduct, but they might not be on an email list that we're paying attention to this piece of legislation as it moves forward.
On that note, VSEA has representation on the council. So I think
Yeah.
through VSEA, VPA, I mean, VTA, obviously with us, I think we can make sure that it does get to everybody that way, rather than reaching out to individuals, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I should clarify. When I said individual, I meant smaller entities
Small
that
units,
might
yeah.
use, you're right, they should be getting it through that.
Yeah.
But I don't know how many emails they get a day where something coming from the VSCA. All right, well, get to that later. Well, this might have a very significant impact that might not draw the attention just by the emails. I mean, it can't hurt for us to just reach out as to all of the entities that we can think of that would be held responsible to a code of conduct. Even like the medical practice board, right? Like that's a unique entity all in and of itself, and their agency head, if I remember right, is not a law enforcement officer, not a certified law enforcement officer.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, they have investigators that work for a civilian, yes.
right. So maybe Kim and I can, between the two of us, maybe draft an email that we could send out to this group to, one, have some input on, but then two, so that we're not missing anybody, send it out so that you as well can send it out to your respective agencies and have them take a look at this code of conduct and offer feedback. And then we'll put a point of contact to send that feedback to, so that it's not coming back to several of us all at different points. I would say Trevor, but he's not here to defend himself, so we'll hold off on that first.
And I don't mind being that point of contact, Chris. So in case we want to just compile all that feedback in one spot.
Okay. That makes sense.
But if we did that, so we sent that out and then at some point met to review the feedback on it and to review again as a group the last version of the code of conduct before it's submitted to the formal rules process, then that would be probably pretty good. I'm just thinking of the timeline, Kim, and when that needs to start going through the formal rules process and when it's supposed to be finalized, and what our deadline is for the informal side of it to tee it up.
Well, and that's where things are interesting. And if we needed to, we can have two slightly different timelines. So for rules making and for what we need to have in the rules, we need to have language regarding the content, but we don't need to put the whole code of conduct in our rules. Like, we need to have language about what what the council would have in a code of conduct, versus what shouldn't be in there, right? Like, we don't want this to become a kitchen sink document. So what sort of parameters do we have on the content that can go in the code? That's what needs to go into the rules, as well as how we implement it and how we change it in the future, right? So that's one set of things the committee needs to do, and that's the next, we're just sort of
Yeah.
easing into the next topic. But, and for those things, Tucker, ideally, we have the rules language ready to go. Like the first week of September is when I need to start the rulemaking process to have it adopted by December 31st. The, any editing of the code, any, shifting around, fine tuning, that can dribble after, like as long as we have those content rules with a big R, we can keep shaping the code of conduct a little bit more, and it doesn't have to be all complete. So the council needs to approve the code of conduct, but how we go about approving it, like that would be in the rules language. So if we had to take a little bit more time on the language, we could do that. Meaning, a little bit past that first week of September.
Mhm.
But I think we'd want a firm deadline on when we'd want the council to approve the code of conduct for that larger piece of putting it out to law enforcement, of training folks, of setting up how we're going to get it to everybody, have them sign it, return it to us, so that when it goes in effect January 1, we're not scrambling on that. And also, what a horrible thing for officers to feel like, they're getting a letter December 15th, right? Like, hey, here's your code of conduct. So, the education piece, we'd want enough time between finalizing it and when it goes into effect.
Yeah.
So that deadline can move a little bit, but this committee would want to just talk through probably setting a deadline, like working your way back from it going into effect, educating, rolling it out, etc.
Well, I think
That's
we can
helpful.
also use some of the processes that we have in place. I mean, the old Rule 13, new Rule 30, we can just build that into their training affidavits. When people sign off on their training affidavits, they can additionally sign off on the code of conduct. And that kind of gives us a time frame that those are at the conclusion of the end of the year. And then obviously they have until March to get them in, but we can build some of that in pretty easily. And if you give officers 2 or 3 months to review it, I think the challenge is some officers don't necessarily refer to it by code of conduct. They've reviewed it because they had issues over, whether there was questions on integrity or questions on violence. But I think if you were to give it to them in October or even September, which is maybe too quickly for folks, but I think by October, sign it on December in your training affidavit, and then the academy would have the latest one by March 1, because that's an already requirement for Rule 13/30.
What would be the feedback, I guess, timeline? Like, when would you want to, if you're going to share it with the profession? And I think we also mentioned like the fair and impartial policing, just some groups just to make sure we're getting feedback on the content. So I know there has to be that September draft for the rulemaking, but I'm just interested in like what would be feasible in terms of getting the feedback and incorporating, knowing that we have all this other stuff to roll out in terms of education. And would end of September be fair?
I think that's very reasonable. Like I said, they've already seen it, just not under the term code of conduct.
Okay.
Yeah, I was thinking even earlier if we could, right? Maybe Kim, like if we could manage to get it out to the field early August, then we could have a month to fine tune it, really incorporate the feedback that we get from it. A month deadline for the return or something like that, so we could have it pretty shored up by early September. I mean, I know it's maybe not, maybe that's a little tight and maybe it's a little unrealistic.
Yeah, I mean, I think Chris and I can get an email drafted, framing this all up with the draft code. We can get that out next week. So what's that,
Yeah.
the last week of July? And then I think if we gave a window of feedback of 30 days,
Yeah.
I think that's reasonable, especially if, if Jen's saying, this again wouldn't be the first time folks are looking at it, but it's under the title, like now they're like, oh, piecing it all together. If that, for folks from law enforcement, if that doesn't feel too tight, I think and always when you leave it too long, right, then folks like push it out and don't look at it. So sometimes a tighter deadline is good that way. And then this committee would have that at the end of August, beginning of September. I think that would be to then work through any of that feedback and then finalize throughout September would be great. Like if that was happening in one stream, like that, if we send that out so that that is out and we're getting feedback, and then in the meantime, we're then able to focus on the language required for our rules, because the rules subcommittee, they're on standby. They have a bunch of meetings scheduled for the next month. They're ready and waiting. Once this committee suggests language to them, then they're ready to start putting that language in the rules. And they're happy to either schedule a cross meeting or, just have things go back and forth. Like you suggest some language, they write it up, and then they'll bring it back for your review. They're open to whatever works best for you all, but they're just, ready and waiting for you. So we could then focus on the rules part of it while getting feedback over the next few weeks.
The only thing I'd also add, Chris and Kim, is you might want to consider kind of giving an open invite for anyone in the profession or anyone to attend one of our meetings of this follow-up if they have questions, if they want to talk about it, just as kind of process buy-in. And because I do see how if someone's just reading this on paper, they won't necessarily appreciate the level of detail and the stakeholder involvement, the profession involvement in the process that has already occurred. And so anyway, I just view it as like process buy-in. That it's already happened, that buy-in from those of us, but just if anyone is wondering what happened, what what's going on, where's this coming from?
Yeah,
This
I think some of them
might
have
help the
heard
process.
that, but I do think you're right. Like some of the people that are not as actively engaged in their associations that have either been affected or been a part of that process that they've had to make a report. So why are we doing this? Why are we even having a code of conduct? And that should be commonplace by now, but I have to say that I've noticed that the criminal justice council meetings have been much more well attended by a lot of law enforcement. So they should have heard these discussions, but I think it would be very specific to this group as to, number one, why did we feel the necessity to come up with a code of conduct? What was the problem that we were seeing that made us create this code of conduct? And then just how thoughtful a process this was from everybody's perspective, from unions' perspective, from employers' perspective, so that they understand that all these things really were taken into consideration. This wasn't, here's a fix to take care of all the law enforcement officers that have done something wrong. This was really well thought out so that we were defining some things that were not already defined in statute. This just made it easier. So I totally agree with you. I think that maybe between Jen and Mark, they might have some ideas of those in their profession that might be good for being invited to one of those meetings to hear that. Because I can think of some people, but they've got clearly the better pulse on who might either be upset by reading or seeing this and not truly appreciating all the details behind it.
Chris, I think that's a good conversation in the communication that goes out about this. And I think it could get incredibly lengthy to try to get into too much of that. But a lot of the feedback may be around things that were considered early on, and we know how we got there so that we don't get feedback that's starting at the beginning.
Right.
How hard will it be to communicate how we got here without overdoing it? It's complicated.
Well, one thing we could
Yeah.
do, Mike, is I agree with you, is attaching to that email the report that we did for the legislature, because that summarized, the work done and didn't go as detailed, but at least shows, like, I think gave some of here's why we started, here's how we got here. But I agree with Tucker that, I mean, you can never invite people enough, right, to come to the meeting if you want to voice something or you want to hear how the sausage is being made. Like, I don't know if you can hear a sausage being made, but you know what I mean. So yeah, I can, one, what we'll do is, like Chris said, I'll draft that email and then send it around to you all. And Mike, if you can, and everyone weigh in on, is this too long? Is this too short? Is this forgetting a whole thing that everyone's going to ask about? So put 2 sentences in, that sort of thing. That'll be really helpful. Because as Chris tells me, sometimes my emails are too long and law enforcement won't read them, is what I'm regularly told.
No, that's a delicate balance, but so that you all know, Kim has now, for the last 3 days, last week, like finally finished her appeal response for the Grismore case. So she's actually able to think again and have new experiences coming her way.
And I do find with law enforcement, one paragraph is where you lose their attention. And this is an issue that needs a lot more than one paragraph.
Yeah.
Well, I'll go heavy on the bullet points. How about that? Heavy on those.
Perfect.
And we can preempt some of that too by re-forwarding some of our initial summary emails, which was, as you were sent on August 15th, and you recall such and such a code of conduct, you'll be receiving an updated email with the following information. Here were some of the considerations brought forward by the chiefs. And we can handle a lot of that in-house as well, even just in some of our meetings, because there were some concerns brought forward that were addressed.
Great.
So I don't want to jump too far ahead, but given this discussion, the fact that we're going to send out that email and let people review the report that was already provided and whatever the content of that email is, and knowing the 3 steps that we have to take to go through the rulemaking process and the dates specific to that, what does everybody's time frame look like for how often do you think we need to meet? And can folks do that in this, trying to stick to this time frame of, getting a draft for September that's ready to go to rules, at least starting that process? Do you think a couple of times a week is too aggressive? Once a week is, I mean, I'm looking, Kim, probably for you, because I'll look to you first because having just gone through the rulemaking process, what that will, entail, and the rules subcommittee that's going to have to do their review of what we send to them. So what do you think is an appropriate time frame for sense of meetings?
So first, to work our way backwards, ideally, the rules changes are approved by the council by the first week of September for me to start the rulemaking process. So to do that, the rules committee is going to need the language to work with, be mid-August, ideally, right, to have a little time with that. So if this I'm suddenly looking at the calendar. If we met once a week for the next 3 weeks and we were just focused on what we want in the rules around the code, I think this group could do that because I don't think these rules need to be overly complicated. I think defining the content might be the thing that has the most conversation around it. I would absolutely understand from law enforcement's perspective, really wanting some firm boundaries on this, so it didn't have the ability to sort of creep beyond the scope that was originally thought of. So I could see that having the most conversation. I think the implementation part of the language, that's going to be, and Jen's already sort of teeing up a potential implementation of basically how we check to make sure folks know about it and how they attest to it. I think we could draft some of that language up in between a meeting and discuss that. And then the future modifications, that's, I think, another part that doesn't have to be overly complicated. We as a subcommittee just have to talk through. I think the big question is it a majority vote or a supermajority vote to change the code of conduct? I think that's the question there. Because as Jen said, we did not, as a group, want the code to be codified, but we do want codified by the legislature. We do want law enforcement to feel like this is a sturdy, steady, dependable document, but it's one that does need to live and change as the times change. But I think, right, we don't want this feeling of it being willy-nilly, like, oh, this year we changed it a little bit, and this year we changed it. So how we change it in the future, that's going to be a conversation. And again, maybe the subcommittee could decide that in one meeting. I don't know, but and that might be just a good, folks may have a feel already for whether you think this is going to be complicated and require more than 3 or 4 meetings, or whether this is pretty straightforward. Any initial thoughts?
I think some of it is pretty straightforward, like defining what the code is. I think we're already there, unless with feedback we need to look at more changes. But I think it's defined very well. And I don't see there being creep in it because there isn't room for movement in it. Those are the violations. And I agree on future changes. I think it should be a supermajority. I don't know how we write those rules, but I don't think it should be changed easily. It should really be thoughtful in the entire group believing that a change is necessary.
I also support that position. And oftentimes we've used the 3-year mark as every 3 years we'll reevaluate and take a look at things. It's not saying that we would have to be beholden to that if something very unusual came forward. But I like the idea of a supermajority. I think it speaks to the thoughtfulness that we've done to this point.
Yeah, I'd also, and I'm not sure exactly how to even frame this thought process, but I would like to keep in mind that one of the reasons that we're here is because of the work of the Professional Regulation Subcommittee and what they saw as loopholes and things that weren't being addressed. So I'd like to be able to, whether it's coupled with a time frame that it gets reviewed, bring in that subcommittee, that if there's something that they see or they're seeing as a pattern of something that we missed in this code of conduct, that they have the ability to weigh in on that process as well. Because that committee, again, it's not law enforcement heavy, I mean, it's a group of 5 and there's one law enforcement and one prior law enforcement, but the rest are community minded folks that are having that review of what they're seeing for professional conduct. So I think their input is valuable to at least be coupled with whatever that time frame looks like when it gets reviewed.
And I'll just add, I mean, I haven't looked at the enabling legislation in a little bit since it was passed, but my sense was essentially the code of conduct itself, with some technical language around it, perhaps, would essentially be the draft rules to be promulgated. Am I off base there? Am I, with some additional context perhaps within the rule to explain it?
Yeah, the way they passed it, Tucker, and you can reread it and make sure I'm not misunderstanding it, but so they required certain things to be in our code. And it was, pretty much what we had in our draft, but they put that in as requirements. So I think as far as where it says we need to have rules regarding the content, it could be as simple as 3 sentences, just uh, defining the code of conduct. To Mike say, we have the content here. I think we just need 1 or 2 sentences, like defining the content of the code, meaning, if we skip forward 10 years from now, there's all new council members and someone wants to add a new paragraph to the code, and I can't even think of a silly example right now, but one that just, falls completely outside of like, what? You want to put that in the code? We need 2 or 3 sentences to prevent that from happening. And I don't have the sentences in my head right now, but essentially, what this code is designed to do is what we just want to have in our rules so that it's clear. So future council member who's like, I want to make it unprofessional conduct that an officer can't blah, blah, blah. They're like, oh, okay, that's interesting, but like, does that fit, what the content of this is supposed to be? And it, like it has to go through that definition, and that's what we need to create. And I think actually some of the language, Tucker, exists in the legislation. We just have to kind of pull and tweak that a little bit.
And I
So
think
they did, sorry, go ahead, Jen.
Yes, I apologize. It's hard when you can't see anybody. So I was just saying, I think we have some of that too. I mean, we can talk about the fact that the big outliers, this code of conduct is designed to regulate, officer behavior that has, on-duty and off-duty conduct that has a nexus to their position in law enforcement. We had some big things that were qualifiers that were really important that I think the next group might not see because they're not necessarily highlighted. I think if we look at those 4 or 5 things that really were our framework, like I'm going to use the nexus to law enforcement and to your ability to do your job was a big framework for us as we started to draw those things out. I think if we take those 3 pillars that we kind of use to create our framework, that essentially can become some of that rule of conduct, supplemented by 2 additional, rule notations as to how often do you review it and how many people do you need to make a change or an affirmation. I think we already have that spelled out.
Yeah, Jen, thank you. Far more articulate as you're driving your nephews around New Hampshire. That's exactly. So I think we can look back in our report. We have some of that language already and in some of our past notes and just pull from that. And that can help feed those rules.
It may be helpful to make sure people have an understanding too of the code of conduct is much different than discipline, agency discipline. There's a lot of minor things where people face discipline and could even face termination, but they may not rise to the level of decertification depending on the standards of the agency you work for. And that's what we'll probably hear is why isn't this in there? Is because it doesn't rise to the level of decertification and action on, your ability to be a law enforcement, but the agency may not want to employ you.
Yeah, exactly. And that can be, we can make the rules can be an area too where that helps distinguish that. So when folks are, why isn't it in here? And then that's what we want our rules to be able to hold up this document.
Yeah, I mean, our members in particular face very serious discipline for some off-duty issues that may not rise to this level, but that discipline does take place.
Mhm.
was something both of you, I think Tucker and Mike, I think this is maybe my not fully understanding like the difference between the language part versus making it into rules. But I did want to make note of that because I didn't see where we would specify if it's off duty versus on duty. Would that need to be specified and saying, hey, whether you're on duty or off duty, these are kind of things that we don't want to see? Would that need to be specified in this code, or would they figure that out in the rules part? That was one thing. And then the second thing is, how do you handle offenses that may have occurred in the past, or do we not care about those? I think, in just adding context, I think as people are reading this, they may have that question in their mind, like, oh no, maybe this was something that they, an offense or something that they did in the past, but it's not an issue for them right now. But they could be worried, like, maybe we will want to specify in the rules, like going forward, this is, and maybe that's already intuitive in terms of this being passed and laid out going forward. But I think that could be a question for people. Um, and I'm sorry, there's one more thing I had a question about. What is okay, is there a transparency mechanism? Okay. This kind of made me think, I think, I can't remember the name of the subcommittee that you were talking about loopholes. There was a subcommittee that brought this all to you. I also wonder, is there like a transparency mechanism? So let's say someone is participating in this behavior that we don't want to see. Do the higher ups or leadership in the departments, do they have to report to someone? Yeah, I don't know. I guess, and maybe that's more implementation. I don't know. But those were the three things that came. Is it off duty, on duty? Um, what about old offenses? And then what's like the mechanism for, like, do they have to report back? Does this information have to come back to somebody?
I can give you a brief summary on that. I served on the Act 56 Professional Regulation Subcommittee that actually examines the allegations of potential misconduct and either holds folks accountable or exonerates them for their actions. That committee is based on a legislative statute that does require that. So if you are an agency head and there are violations of certain categories which used to be category A, B, and C, which are now going to be supplemented by this code of conduct, there are requirements for an officer to submit that. If the agency head fails to submit or do a valid investigation, the agency head themselves can be held accountable. That led to what this has been created, which is the issue of the lack of off-duty conduct regulation. So we had officers who had been accused of engaging in behavior that is inappropriate for somebody of the position of an officer to continue to do and still be able to have the trust of the community to do their job properly. There was no current statute element that allowed the professional regulations to hold people accountable for their behavior if they were not on duty. In certain categories, there were a few that, if you did these 12 things, it didn't matter if you were on or off duty. But there were a lot of things that kind of fell by the wayside. And so the entire intent of this was to address that, so that this code of conduct applied whether you were on duty or off duty. If you engaged in this behavior, you would have the likelihood that you could be held accountable from your professional standpoint. And then to clarify that further, the requirement for that conduct was that it would also somehow impact your ability to do your job moving forward. Something as simple as if you lied by telling your spouse that they did not look fat in a dress when maybe they did, that would not necessarily be an integrity issue. But if you lied on the stand, that would be an integrity issue. So it had to have a nexus to your position in law enforcement. Or if you were to make a racist comment on an online video game when you were off duty, there was no mechanism for being able to hold somebody accountable prior to this code of conduct. However, now moving forward, if somebody was to do something that in the public would cause distrust and lead there to believe that there was their actions moving forward might be impacted because of those racist statements they made, now there is a nexus. So the on-duty, off-duty conduct is there is really no differential there, as long as there is a nexus. And yes, from an Act 56, if they don't report it, they can be held accountable from the council.
Thank
And
you. That's
Tiffany, I'm sorry, Jen, if you mentioned this, but the past offenses, Tiffany, it's a great question, and I think it is one that part of the education as we put this out. Once this goes into effect, January 1st, 2025, that's when officers can be held accountable to this code of conduct. If, say, a complaint comes into us, January 15th, but it's from behavior in August of 2024, that officer wouldn't be held to this. They would be held to what the rules were in place and the statutes in place at the time that the behavior occurred.
okay. That makes sense. That's very helpful. And I know we're coming up on time, so there's just one more thing, and I'm gonna stop. The only
No,
the
that's
only
all good.
the only thing that comes to mind now is the so, and this maybe this is more of a feedback from like other folks, but there's an issue with like I guess, and I'm kind of reading up on this more so understanding it. So like visible tattoos that might have a certain leaning or representation of certain groups or things that might be like a hate group or something like that. Um, that may be something to think more about because that could have been something that was done in youth or in the past. But how do you and maybe this is not as much of an issue, but just something in the back of my mind in terms of like making sure that we think about that a little bit in terms of display of that those kind of markings and because it may not have any for some folks it might not have a current bearing in terms of how they think about the world or think about people but if they're coming into contact with people who see that they may have an intimidation or it could be an issue so that's just something that's I don't know. I kind of don't know how to frame that, but like visible markings, would that need to be covered up? That kind of thing.
Tiffany, I think the discrimination section, the way it's written, would cover something like that. I know there's also employment standards on who can be hired, but if they get something after they're hired, it may be problematic. But I think number two, discrimination, would cover that if they're displaying something as a tattoo on their body. Would everybody else agree?
Yeah, I think it's also agency specific, right? The agencies have safeguards in place for some tattoos that are visible that even though they may not be offensive, they may not want members of their agency to display tattoos for whatever the rationale is behind their agency. And because of that's, I don't think the professional regulation has ever had a case like that. But it brings up an interesting point, right? If somebody has a swastika tattooed on their forearm and that's visible, is that unprofessional conduct? That might say something about the mindset of an officer, but it's not conduct that they're doing, whether on or off duty, unless there's another action that goes along with that tattoo or a comment made in reference to it. So again, this subcommittee has seen a lot of things that they didn't have the ability to interact with or about, and now they do with this code of conduct, but will never, I don't think, ever reach the ability to deal with every single thing that happens that might be offensive to people, but may not be related to the officer's conduct. Good question, though.
Yeah, I still think number two would get it because it doesn't cover just discriminatory conduct or exhibits bias against. And I think a tattoo like that would fall under that where it exhibits a bias.
Well, I
At
think
least
that's a
that's
perfect
just my thoughts.
example. Yeah, and it's a perfect example of what, as we're looking to finalize the code, is thinking through that example and then going back and reading number two. And off the top of my head agreeing with Mike as I kind of speed read through it, but like, would that show clearly and substantially demonstrates that you cannot perform your duties of office fair and impartially? Like, that would be the question. But I think we need to, as a subcommittee, think, and we did this a lot before, but doing it again, like raising things that we'd be concerned about and seeing like, does this cover it or does it not? And are we okay with it not covering it, or, and just kind of, yeah, rereading it with those potential scenarios in mind would be really helpful. And I know I have to reread this thinking how a defense attorney is going to read it. And that's my work that I need to do to just see if there's any language in there that I may suggest needs a little editing, not a lot. So it's 2:00, Chris, and poor
Yes.
Mike sitting on the side of the road, and who knows
That's
where
okay.
Jen is.
I'm good.
You're good.
So before closing, is it possible to come to an agreement on perhaps a day of the week that works for everybody and or a time so that we could set some future meeting dates? I mean, what is it? Wednesday today. Does this date and time work for everybody to just keep this same consistency, or was this not a good time and we were just all accommodating?
It usually is for me, but the 7th, I will be on the road driving all day, and that won't work for me because I won't have the time to stop. I'm going to drive to Delaware.
Wednesday at 1 isn't a good time for me. Maybe Monday at 1. Is that a chance?
Mondays are good for me.
Monday works for me.
Should we try and Chris has Mondays?
I'm waiting for my calendar to respond to me. It's giving me the not responding mode. I could. We're talking 1 o'clock again?
Mm-hmm.
No, I'm sorry, Monday won't work for me. I'm good. I am good before 12:30 and after 3. But I also don't necessarily have to be there if others can be.
Would this be easier to do with a quick doodle poll, putting together 5 or 6 different options and seeing where people are at? I know that we have to set an agenda and get a schedule together. But would it be easier
That
to
way we
do
could-
it graphically?
That way
Yeah.
we could get
We're
Trevor.
missing 3 people too.
Right, Trevor and Jim and Mark. I can send one out this afternoon and can word it. Yeah, send out a variety of dates and times for next week with the idea of looking for folks to select a time and date that can recur for the next few weeks. Does that work?
Thank you, Kim, for all your help with
I
this
love
group.
me a doodle poll, nothing better. Just highlight of a day. Yeah, I can do that this
We'll
afternoon.
respond. We'll respond.
Well, I told Tucker I always notice who responds first, so just
Uh-uh.
consider it a competition, everybody. I take note on who responds first. And I can let you all know who wins next time.
And she made it very clear when I never responded to the first one to me. So
Yeah,
I
I was
was
like,
first on
Tucker
the second one
responds,
though.
Chris, why can't you?
I got that email too. Don't worry. It's okay.
I
know
was
you're
nicer
trying
to
to keep us
Tiffany
on
than I
track.
was to Chris, though.
Oh, no. I'm looking forward to the next. This is really, really helpful. I'm looking forward to the next meeting. So I'm happy to, support and, I'm learning a lot too. So
That's good.
Well, and we appreciate you jumping into the deep end because we're definitely, yeah, we appreciate you wanting to learn and help figure this out with us. Cool, okay. Public comment, otherwise we can wrap it up.
Look for a motion to adjourn.
I'll make the
Moved.
motion.
Frank, second.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for attending today, and watch for that poll to come out. Kim's
Have your
counting.
fingers ready. Poor Mike's driving. He's like, I'm at a
That's right.
disadvantage.
Have a good
Yeah.
afternoon.
Bye.
All right.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.